guys, welcome to Wickedly Judged, the podcast dedicated to exposing wrongful convictions and fighting for justice reform in America. I'm Rebecca, your host, and if you're new here, this show is for anyone who believes that justice isn't just a verdict. It's a promise, a process, and far too often, a fight. Here at Wickedly Judged, we shine a light on the cracks in our justice system by sharing the real stories, true life of those who have been wrongfully accused, convicted, and forgotten by the courts. We give a voice to their families, advocates, and survivors who refuse to accept injustice as the end of their story. Before we dive in, a quick thank you to our sponsors, Veteran Alliance, Yarn Therapy for Me, Justin Apron, Liberty First Radio, NDVLB, Prime Ledger Group, JSIL, and Wickedly Judged Justice Activation Project. And a special thanks to JP Verse of Versefire Records, providing our powerful intro and outro music. Your guys' support fuels our mission. Thank you so much for standing with us in the fight to expose wrongful convictions and demanding true justice in America. Tonight's episode is the beginning of a series that I never imagined I would be able to make one day. This series is about the case against my husband, Johnny Watkins. And I know before anybody says anything, I've already done numerous episodes on this, but these episodes are a little different. The next 5 episodes are literally going to be breaking down his case and why the inconsistencies matter. Before we begin, I need to make something absolutely clear. This episode is not about disrespecting victims. It's not about pretending a tragedy didn't occur. And it's definitely not about sensationalism. Because at the end of the day, a man lost his life. A family suffered unimaginable loss, and nothing about that should ever be minimized. But questioning whether a conviction can withstand scrutiny is not anti-victim. And when the record itself reflects unresolved inconsistencies, conflicting witness narratives, inaccessible records, and constitutional concerns, those issues deserve to be examined. That is what this series is about. The record, the transcripts, the witness statements, the archived materials, the motion for leave that was recently filed, and the constitutional concerns raised throughout the motion. But tonight, we are focusing on one of the most important factual issues in the entire case. The knife. Who possessed it? Who controlled it? Who handled it? Who disposed of it? And why the testimony surrounding that knife became one of the biggest reliability concerns reflected throughout the proceedings. Because according to the testimony and witness materials recovered in this case, the stories did not stay consistent. Not across statements, not across testimony, not across time. And perhaps, most importantly, the alleged murder weapon was never recovered. Before we go deeper into the constitutional issues and inconsistencies, I think it is important to slow down and actually walk through the night itself the way listeners would have experienced it if they had been there. Because one of the biggest mistakes people make when looking at criminal cases years later is assuming that events unfolded in some neat, perfectly organized sequence. But that is not reality. According to the testimony, statements, and materials recovered in this case, the environment that night was chaotic. There were multiple young people gathered together. There was drinking, there were tensions, there were shifting emotions, and according to testimony, there had already been a prior conflict involving members of the group weeks before the homicide ever took place. Not to mention the physical altercation that happened between two of the people that were there that night. In opening statements, prosecutors referenced an earlier incident where one of the boys allegedly walked off with some beer as a prank. But according to testimony later, which is reflected in the record, that earlier incident involved the witnesses themselves and not Johnny Watkins. That matters because it establishes existing tensions inside the group before the homicide ever occurred. And once I started reconstructing the timeline from the transcripts, one thing became very clear. Different people described the night very differently. According to some testimony, Caleb was initially away from the campfire area over near the pond. Other testimony placed Caleb near the scene before the stabbing. Some statements reflected Caleb already possessing the knife. Other testimony suggested Johnny placed the knife in Caleb's hand. Some statements reflected Caleb disposing of the weapon afterward. Yet other statements reflected Billy allegedly admitting to disposing of the weapon. And because the weapon itself was never recovered, there was never a definitive scientific way to resolve those competing accounts. That becomes incredibly important because the deeper I reconstructed the timeline from the transcripts and statements, the more obvious it became that this case depended heavily upon witness interpretation and evolving memory. And that is exactly why consistency matters so much. To understand why the knife became so important, we first need to understand the nature of the state's case. This was not a case that was built on overwhelming physical evidence. Actually, it was the contrary. There was no recovered murder weapon. There was no definitive forensic evidence conclusively resolving who possessed the knife. There was no clean scientific narrative that settled the competing version of events. Instead, the state's theory depended heavily on witness testimony only. And that matters, because when testimony becomes the centerpiece of a homicide case, consistency and reliability become critically important. But according to the transcripts, witness statements, and materials later recovered during the post-conviction investigation, the witness accounts surrounding the knife repeatedly changed. One witness would place the knife in Caleb's possession. Another witness would describe Johnny placing the knife in Caleb's hand. Another statement would discuss the disposal of the weapon. And another witness would later reportedly admit disposing of it himself. So tonight, we are going to walk through those contradictions carefully, not emotionally, not recklessly, but directly from the record. One of the most significant reliability concerns reflected in the record involves Caleb. Because according to multiple witness-related statements and testimony, Caleb was repeatedly connected to possession of the knife before, during, and after the stabbing. That's important because this was not just a single isolated statement. There were multiple references involving Caleb and the knife. There were statements indicating Caleb possessed the knife before the confrontation escalated. There were statements indicating that the knife belonged to Caleb. There were statements placing the knife in Caleb's hand during the stabbing. And there were statements discussing Caleb allegedly going to the pond afterward and washing his hands and disposing of the knife. But then Caleb's own testimony complicated the situation dramatically. Because according to Caleb's testimony, Johnny approached him and placed the knife into his hand. Caleb testified that he threw the knife down. Then, according to Caleb, Johnny picked the knife back up and placed it back into Caleb's hand. And then Caleb goes on to describe being dragged towards Steve Eakins. Now think about how important that sequence is. And also think about how much time elapsed during that sequence. Because according to other witness testimonies, it was one fluid motion. Steve got hit in the back of the head with a log, and then he was stabbed. Maybe 5 seconds in between the two. But that directly conflicts with testimony suggesting Caleb already possessed the knife before the stabbing. See, those are not small inconsistencies. Those are fundamentally different factual narratives that goes to the credibility and reliability of the witnesses. And that goes to the reliability of the conviction itself. And when narratives surrounding the central physical evidence in a homicide case conflict, that significantly, reliability becomes a serious issue. Then we get to Jake. Jake's testimony creates even more questions. According to the record, Jake stated that Caleb was not initially near the fire and instead was out by the pond. But other testimony placed Caleb near the fire before the stabbing. Even more than that, other testimony placed Caleb right next to Johnny when it happened. So that inconsistency matters because location of where Caleb was affects the timing, the visibility, the witness perception, and whether Caleb already possessed the knife. Because Jake testified that Caleb pulled the knife out of his pocket. Jake also described the stabbing at one point as occurring in one fluid motion, but then he later acknowledged that he couldn't really see who was doing what. Well, again, that matters because certainty matters. And then there are the contradictions involving the knife itself. Jake's testimony reflected a version where Caleb already had the knife. Caleb's testimony reflected a version where Johnny allegedly forced the knife into Caleb's hand. And because the weapon was never recovered, there was no scientific evidence capable of resolving those competing accounts. When no weapon is recovered, there's no fingerprint analysis, no forensic testing on the knife, only evolving witness statements to fit the narrative. And that is one of the reasons these inconsistencies became so important in the motion for leave that we just filed. Because the motion argues that meaningful review requires consideration of the complete court record. That includes the later discovered materials and contradictions that undermine confidence in the proceedings themselves. Now we arrive at one of the biggest unresolved factual issues in the entire case when it comes to the knife. What happened to the knife? Because according to witness-related materials, Caleb was allegedly connected to the disposal of the weapon. There were statements discussing Caleb going to the pond, washing his hands, and throwing the knife into the pond. And then there was a statement where Caleb allegedly turned around afterward and said words substantially similar to, "That's how you do it, boys. Handle your business." Now, regardless of how anyone interprets that statement, it obviously becomes highly significant because it directly concerns possession and disposal of the alleged murder weapon. But then another major contradiction emerged. According to additional statements reflected in the materials recovered during post-conviction investigation, Billy reportedly admitted that he is the one that disposed of the weapon. So now there are competing narratives concerning the single most important physical item in the entire case. One narrative says Caleb disposed of the knife. Another says Billy disposed of it. And again, there is no recovered weapon capable of resolving those contradictions. Was the weapon ever disposed of? Or did one of them take it home? See, this is not a minor issue. This is a major factual inconsistency tied directly to the state's theory of what happened. Now, I want listeners to understand something important. This episode is not claiming that one little inconsistency automatically proves innocence. That is not how post-conviction litigation works. What matters is the overall cumulative effect. The motion for leave that we recently filed raises broader constitutional concerns involving the incomplete record accessibility, delayed transcript recovery, archive investigative materials, conflicting witness accounts of what actually happened and who did what and where, and meaningful appellate review. See, when you don't have a complete court record, any appeal that is filed does not have meaningful appellate review because they're not reviewing all the facts of the case. The knife issue matters because it demonstrates how unstable and conflicting portions of the factual narrative became. And when those inconsistencies are viewed together with the fact that there were inaccessible records, missing materials, incomplete forensic evidence, and evolving testimony, the confidence in the proceedings begins to break down. That is the bigger constitutional issue. And that is what later episodes are going to examine. Because the knife is only one piece of a much larger story. So tonight's episode was about one central question. Can a conviction remain reliable when the testimony concerning the alleged murder weapon repeatedly conflicts and the weapon itself was never recovered? That question matters. But in the next episode, we are going to move into something even bigger: the record itself, the archived proceedings, the untranscribed hearings, the recovered cassette recordings, the witness materials, and why the motion for leave argues that prior review proceedings occurred without a truly complete record. Because once you understand what remained buried for years, the constitutional concerns become even harder to ignore. Don't let these stories end just because this episode is over. If you believe in the work that we're doing, here's how you can help us right now. Follow Wickedly Judged wherever you listen to podcasts. Share this episode with someone who cares about truth and accountability. Follow us on social media. Leave a review. It's one of the fastest ways to help more people find these cases. If you happen to share a post on social media, tag us so we can thank you and amplify the conversation. And if you're able to support the mission directly, please donate to help fuel our investigations, advocacy, and education efforts. Or support the work by grabbing merchandise at wickedlyjudged.com. Every share, review, donation, and purchase helps us keep pushing for real justice reform. As always, stay informed, stay vigilant, and stay hopeful, because nobody deserves to be wickedly judged.